imagine you're at a Bears game where the time of the right? One there and one over here. One person there, one in this corner.
Hey, Richard, the way I was going to do this was and then let me do the introduction. Do you want to do the introduction first so you can get out of it? I know, that's my goal. So, you want to do it? There goes another one. State Senate Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. We have an important hearing this afternoon, obviously, as we talk about the President-elect's nomination of Antony J. Blinken to be Secretary of State, and we'll get to that very quickly. Every time I'm sworn in for a new term, as a matter of personal privilege for just 2 minutes, every time I'm sworn in for a new term, I kind of think back. This is as I start my 41st year, I've learned some things over that period of time. I spent 28 years in our state senate, over 2 decades as leading it, and now 13 years here. And some things I've learned, I can make very briefly an observation. If we treat each other with kindness and respect, we get things done. One of the best friends I had during my time in the state senate was the Democrat leader. We're still close personal friends. My wife and I stay with him when we travel to North Idaho. He consults with me frequently and gives me advice even when I don't want it. And we have become and stayed very, very good friends over the years. We always got things done in Idaho. And I hope that as we go forward, that we will do likewise here. This not only is beginning of my 41st year in a Senate body, this will be my 53rd year of married to my wife. And after completing 36 elections, I consider that all quite an accomplishment. So with that, we're going to proceed to hear from Mr. Blinken after we make our opening statements. But Senator Durbin has very, very important matters that he must attend to, and we're honored to have him come and address this august body. And Senator Durbin, the floor is yours.
Chairman Risch, thank you very much. It's great to be back in the committee, which I served on many years ago. And Senator Menendez, thank you for your leadership and all of you who've gathered here today. I've been asked, and I'm honored that Mr. Blinken asked me to come before the committee and make an introduction. I'm not going to do what most do and reread his entire biography, which you've all seen and I'm sure are impressed with as I am. I just want to make a few points about the job he seeks and the moment he seeks it. On September 12, 2001, just hours after the 9/11 terrorist attack on the United States, the leading French newspaper, Le Monde, published a front-page headline of 4 words: "Nous sommes tous Américains." We are all Americans. With those 4 words, the people of France acknowledged the danger and pain in the United States and quite simply said, "We'll stand with you." Despite many differences on many issues, that's what friends are for. That is the reason that alliances count. With the end of the Trump administration, we face a stark choice. Does America first mean America alone? Does our nation still need friends and allies? Over the past 4 years, many of the strongest bonds between America and our allies have been strained, lifelong friends have been shunned, and authoritarian adversaries have been embraced. The role of the United States in the world, its values, its allies, its adversaries are in question. The world is waiting for a clear policy from our new president, and our new president has chosen one man to lead that effort, Tony Blinken. When you take a look at his background, it starts with the State Department. It includes service as staff director on this committee with the National Security Council, working as Deputy Secretary of State. It's an amazing background. And there's also a moment, which I'm sure you all have seen and we've seen over and over again. There was that iconic photograph in the Situation Room when approximately 12 people were gathered with the President and Vice President of the United States and Secretary of State to see if finally we would capture Osama bin Laden. Tony Blinken was in that room. It tells you that he was more than just a peripheral staffer. He was an integral part of the security decisions of the United States of America. He's ready for this job, and we know it. There's one thing that we discussed before we walked in here that I think is a critical element, and that is the fact that he inherits a great department and many men and women who've dedicated their lives to the security of the United States of America. We need them. We see their expertise wherever we travel, in every corner of the world. Sometimes at great personal sacrifice, they are representing this country and literally risking their lives to do so. It is his job, and he understands it, to thank them for their efforts and to make sure that their morale is at the highest level so that America continues to be well represented around the world. It is my honor to introduce Tony Blinken today as the next Secretary of State. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Durbin. I know you have other things to do, so we will excuse you. And what we're going to do here today is I'm going to give some opening remarks. I'm then going to turn it over to Senator Menendez for his opening remarks. And after that, we will do a round of questioning. Each senator will be given 10 minutes. I will do it on a seniority basis, unlike our usual early bird process that we use. But because of the size of this, I think that it's important that we do it on a seniority basis. So with all that said, today's hearing is unquestionably significant. The Secretary of State is one of, if not the most important nominations that a president makes. He represents our interests abroad and is also looked to for defining America's role and posture in the world. Over the past several decades, we have watched nations with authoritarian ideologies and imperial tendencies increasingly attempt to grow their influence on the world stage. And unfortunately, that has happened with some success on their part. These countries challenge the very principles upon which the United States was founded: democracy and the rule of law. As the Biden administration begins tomorrow, there are several key foreign policy issues that need immediate attention. My most important concern, as Mr. Blinken and I talked about a few in my office not long ago, is Iran and the President-elect's promise to return to the JCPOA. President Obama thought the JCPOA would empower Iran moderates and see Iran abandon its nuclear weapons program. But this notion proved to be misplaced. The Iranian regime cannot separate itself from its revolutionary ideology. The JCPOA provided very beneficial sanctions relief for Iran, yet it failed to eliminate Iran's support for terrorist proxies, therefore allowing them to fund terrorism across the region. The deal also included very short-sighted sunsets on Iranians' conventional weapons and ballistic missile programs and allowed Iran to continue enriching uranium. Any new deal with Iran must address all of the facets of Iranian bad behavior, including its ballistic missile program and ending support for terrorism. I fully understand and I fully comprehend that people want to focus on their nuclear ambitions, but these people have other bad activities that they're involved in that also need to be addressed. Unfortunately, the Iranian regime thinks it has successfully waited out the maximum pressure program that we've had in place. Only time will tell if they're right. At the time, President Obama used the extensive sanctions regime Congress created as a leverage to begin the JCPOA talks, and so he should have. President-elect Biden should take advantage of the significant leverage that has been provided through the maximum pressure program and negotiate a new deal that includes Iran's regional aggression. A policy of containment rather than appeasement is the only approach that will be successful. However, any discussions with Iran should begin and end with our allies in the region. Israel and many of our other Gulf allies felt the United States abandoned them and their security concerns during the JCPOA negotiations. With U.S. leadership over the last 4 years, our relations were rebuilt and paved the way for the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords signed last year were a significant step in fundamentally improving the security, economic, and diplomatic environment in the Middle East. But they also underscored the significant threat that Iran poses to our regional partners. I would hope future negotiations with Iran would include extensive consultations with not just Congress, but also Israel and our Gulf partners. And given its significant implications, any new deal should also be submitted as a treaty for Senate ratifications. I understand that that's a controversial issue, but if we're going to have the support of the United States, it can't just be one branch of government. It needs to be all branches of government. I hope that the Biden administration will adhere to these conditions before and during any engagement with Iran, and I sincerely appreciate, Mr. Blinken, your offer that prior to beginning or ending all of these negotiations, there will be significant consultation with this committee. I greatly appreciate that. Another area of serious concern with the new administration, obviously, is China, which I believe will be our greatest foreign policy challenge of this century. On a personal note, I want to thank you, Mr. Blinken, for having read the report, the 143-page report that I published just recently, and I also appreciate the kind words that you had for the conclusions and suggestions in that report. China is a strategic and global competitor of the United States, and the Chinese Communist Party routinely engages in economic coercion, military aggression, human rights abuses, and influence operations. Its policies deliberately damage U.S. interests and values. In the face of the Chinese Communist Party's dangerous goals, the United States must maintain a strong competitive stance. Rising to this challenge is now a sprint and a marathon that will require sustained political will, expanded cooperation with allies and partners, and properly aligned resources and personnel. Last year, I introduced the Strategic Act, the first comprehensive legislative proposal to compete with China effectively. This bill was written with Democratic senators' input and other Democrat organizations around this city who are in the think tank business, along with Republican think tanks. It should be noted that China is not a partisan issue. It is an American issue. I know Senator Menendez has strong concerns in this regard also, and I hope we will work together as we move forward with those challenges. I hope and expect that the Biden administration will pursue bipartisan cooperation on challenges posed by the Chinese Communist Party. One of those challenges is Taiwan. The PRC's obliteration of Hong Kong's autonomy last year makes the question of Taiwan's future all the more urgent and serious. China's military modernization and expansion has dramatically shifted the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. This is eroding conventional deterrence, putting the U.S. military as well as Indo-Pacific allies and partners at risk. Taiwan is among the strategically consequential issues and should remain a key strategic priority. Finally, the COVID-19 pandemic has evolved into the largest, most destructive global health emergency in more than a century. More than 83 million people have been infected and 1.8 million people have died. Economies have been upended, schools and offices closed, and livelihoods destroyed. It will take years to recover from this global health catastrophe. There is a lot we still do not know about COVID-19, but two things are clear. Its global spread was accelerated by catastrophic failures at all levels of the existing global health security architecture. And unless we do something now, it will happen again. Last year, I introduced an effort to help the United States and our international partners get ahead of the next pandemic. I, along with my committee colleagues, pressed the WHO to launch an independent interim review of its response to the outbreak so we could figure out what worked, what didn't, and how to prepare for future outbreaks. The WHO ultimately followed our suggestion. If confirmed, I'm committed to working with you, Mr. Blinken, to advance reforms at the WHO that will help restore public confidence and enable it to more effectively respond to crisis in real time. I, along with Senator Murphy, Cardin, and Portman, also introduced bipartisan legislation to strengthen the ability of the United States and our international partners to detect, prevent, and respond to outbreaks before they become pandemics. I'm well aware that Senator Menendez also has a strong interest in this area, and I look forward to working with him and with the committee as we move legislation forward. This bill, the Global Health Security and Diplomacy Act, provides much-needed leadership and direction for U.S. global health security efforts overseas and incentivizes greater leadership and investment by others. I'm also eager to work with you, Mr. Blinken, if confirmed, to further redefine and enact this important legislation. Over the last 5 years, the world has seen dramatic change, and it is imperative policies are updated to reflect these new realities. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on these important issues, and I thank you for being here today, and I thank you and your family for the willingness to take on the sacrifice to serve in this important position. With that, Senator Menendez, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first of all start off by saying I appreciate your efforts to work with me to get this hearing up today, to expedite the consideration of one of the most important national security positions in our government, the Secretary of State. So thank you.
You're welcome. And I think all of us have a very strong interest in seeing that the President has in place as rapidly as possible his national security team. Thank you for that.
I'll say amen to that, and I appreciate this, and also hopefully, if everything works out well, the expeditious consideration at a committee meeting to vote out the nominee. And let me just say one remark. I'll save my remarks about our future work together as a committee when the gavel changes, but as someone who has met your lovely wife, you are an incredibly fortunate man to have had over a half a century with her as a partner. So
no one knows better than I.
So congratulations to you on such a great long time together. She's just an incredibly charming person. Mr. Blinken, congratulations on your nomination. You're superbly qualified and prepared to be our next Secretary of State. And you have impressed us all over the years with your intellect, your dedication, and your humanity, including during your successful tenure as Deputy Secretary of State, Deputy National Security Advisor, and as Staff Director of this committee. Now, while tomorrow's inauguration is a time for healing and renewal, I am nonetheless compelled to speak about the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. The images from that day are permanently seared in our collective conscience. Terrorists defiling the Capitol with Confederate flags and Nazi images, seeking to take hostage or perhaps kill our democratically elected leaders, savagely beating police officers. And in that respect, my heart goes out to the family of New Jersey native and Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, who succumbed to those injuries, and the family of Capitol Police Officer Howard Libengood, as well as dozens of other officers injured in the attack. This attack on the very foundation of our democracy delivered a tragic reminder that our ability to project power abroad is inextricably linked to the health and strength of our democracy. This does not mean that we cannot talk about the importance of democracy abroad, no, but rather we must show that senators and all other leaders in this country have a duty to stand up for democracy, for the Constitution, for the rule of law. There can be no exceptions. And I expect that from the Biden administration, and based on my experience, I know, Mr. Blinken, you will do so in word and deed. Now, if confirmed, your task will be to repair and restore America's place in the world. You'll face complex challenges all over the globe. The world's on fire. Rebuilding alliances, restoring American leadership at international institutions, tackling problems that define our times and defy borders like climate change, migration, and COVID-19. And you will need to recenter our foreign policy around the core American values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. But you will need to do so thoughtfully. Over the past year, the world has watched the United States completely falter on a national response to COVID-19. continue its overdue reckoning with systemic racism, and struggle with the president's obsession with thwarting the peaceful transfer of power, pushing disinformation, and attacking a free press. As we work to advance American interests around the globe and seek to create a more democratic, prosperous, and secure world, we have to redouble our efforts at home to secure a more perfect union for all Americans. Now, as you're likely aware, North Korea, Russia, Turkey require some immediate attention. Over the past 4 years, North Korea's nuclear and missile programs have continued to grow unchecked. In other words, the United States and our allies are more at risk now than after 4 years of President Trump than when he took office. A revanchist Russia continues to threaten the United States and our allies, including through the recent SolarWinds cyber attack, the spread of disinformation, and efforts to silence and murder political opposition. And Turkey continues to be destabilizing by supporting Azerbaijan's aggression in Nagorno-Karabakh and through its own aggressive behavior in the Eastern Mediterranean against our democratic allies, Greece and Cyprus. From a broader regional perspective, one of your most important challenges will be to forge a coherent strategy for the Indo-Pacific, one led by our values, centered on our allies and partners, and implemented with consistency. As you know, I believe that while the Trump administration got some of the questions about the region right, they came up with the wrong answers. At a time when we should have been strengthening our alliances, building new partnerships, empowering a multilateral architecture, expanding commercial ties, and ensuring the vitality of democracy and the rule of law, the Trump administration, in almost every case, did the exact opposite. And after 4 years of the Trump administration, we are in a worse position to effectively compete with China than before. So I'm interested in hearing more about what your top priorities will be if confirmed in approaching the Indo-Pacific region and how our China policy nests within this larger framework. We also have a number of ongoing challenges in the Middle East, perhaps none so pressing as Iran. As you know, I was not a proponent of the JCPOA, but I also believe the Trump administration's decision to withdraw without a serious strategy involving our allies would ultimately leave us less safe and Iran emboldened. Unfortunately, Iran's continuing aggression across the Middle East and its recent nuclear activity that has dramatically advanced its capabilities has vindicated that prediction. Now, I understand the Biden administration is interested in returning to a diplomatic path, which I support, but I fear returning to the JCPOA without concrete efforts to address Iran's other dangerous and destabilizing activity would be insufficient. I believe there's bipartisan support to find a comprehensive diplomatic approach with Iran that includes working closely with our European and regional partners if we take those other issues into consideration. Closer to home, political crises in Latin America have caused human rights and humanitarian disasters on an unprecedented scale. Simply put, addressing rampant crime, weak governance, corruption, climate-related displacement in the Northern Triangle must be a top priority for the country and deeply impacts the security and economic well-being of Americans. Further south, I'm encouraged by the Biden administration's plans to renew our commitment to the multilateral efforts we must lead in order to improve the effectiveness of international sanctions and humanitarian aid as we pursue a diplomatic solution to the Venezuelan crisis. Maduro's campaign of crimes against humanity and attacks against interim President Juan Guaido and democratic civil society, which I hope the administration will recognize interim President Guaido, all have serious implications for U.S. national security and regional stability. Mr. Blinken, I also hope you'll support Ambassador Bill Richardson's efforts to free the six Americans who have been unjustly detained in Venezuela. I'm confident that if confirmed, you'll do everything you can to repair and restore American leadership abroad. Foundational to that effort will be rebuilding and reinvigorating the State Department itself. As you well know, our career foreign and civil servants are incredibly talented and dedicated. Over the past few years, however, they have been treated with disdain, smeared, and forced out of public service. There has been a stunning loss of expertise, steep declines in morale, little accountability for those at the top, and the State Department still has not achieved a workforce that comes close to reflecting the diversity of our country. This state of affairs has impacted relationships across the globe, the Department's ability to engage in the interagency process, and in its relationship with Congress. So the challenges you'll be facing are immense, but I have confidence in your experience and expertise. I look forward to hearing your testimony, and upon confirmation, I look forward to working with you to restore America's place in the world and to repair and rebuild our relationships and our institutions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. Ms. Blinken, after our conversations earlier today and after hearing our opening statements, Senator Menendez input in that regard, as you can see, there isn't a whole lot of daylight between us on most of these issues. Certainly almost none whatsoever when it comes to objectives. Strategy and how to get there is obviously something that needs to be negotiated, and all of our best heads put together to try to get to that position. So we're interested in hearing that. Obviously, as Senator Menendez said, Iran is at the top of the list. China and Russia are right behind that. We have serious problems in Turkey. North Korea is on the list, and there's lots and lots of challenges. But we will do better if we all pull the wagon together, and I think we're headed in that direction right now. So with that, again, thank you for your willingness to serve, and the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And to you, to Ranking Member Menendez, to all the members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And I greatly appreciate everything you've done to make this hearing possible in this time. And I want to thank Senator Durbin in absentia for his very kind introduction. It is truly the honor of a lifetime to appear before this committee as President-elect Biden's nominee to be Secretary of State. And it's an honor that carries special significance for me for two reasons. First, as you've noted, I had the privilege of serving as the Democratic Staff Director of this committee for 6 years, working alongside a distinguished group of senators, including several still on the committee today, to advance American diplomacy and safeguard the interests of the American people. That experience gave me an abiding respect for this committee, for its finest bipartisan traditions, for the caliber of its members and staff, for the essential work it does to strengthen U.S. leadership around the world. If I have the honor of being confirmed, those lessons that I learned in my years with this committee will guide my approach to our work together. The second point of significance for me is a little bit more personal. In addition to my own confirmation as Deputy Secretary of State, this committee confirmed my wife, Evan Ryan, who is here with me today, as Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs. Confirmed my uncle, Alan Blinken, as Ambassador to Belgium, and confirmed my father, Donald Blinken, as Ambassador to Hungary. I hope I don't break the streak today. My family, especially my wife and our children, John and Lila, is my greatest blessing. Our tradition of public service is a source of tremendous pride. I view that tradition as something of a sacred duty, payment on the debt that our family owes to the nation that gave so many of my relatives refuge and extraordinary opportunities across the generations. My grandfather, Maurice Blinken, found refuge in America after fleeing Russian pogroms. My father's wife, Vera Blinken, found refuge in America after fleeing the communist regime in Hungary. And my late stepfather, Samuel Pizar, found refuge in America after enduring the horrors of the Holocaust. Sam was the only survivor among his immediate family and school of 900 children in Białystok, Poland, after 4 years in the concentration camps. At the end of the war, he made a break from a death march into the Bavarian woods, and from his hideout, he heard the rumbling sound of a tank. And as he looked out, instead of seeing the dreaded Iron Cross, he saw a 5-pointed white star. And so he ran to the tank and got to it. The hatch opened. An African-American GI looked down at him. He fell to his knees and said the only 3 words that he knew in the English language that his mother had taught him before the war. God bless America. The GI lifted him into the tank, into freedom, into America. That's who we are. That's what we represent to the world, however imperfectly, and what we can still be when we're at our best. If I have the honor of serving as Secretary of State, that is the vision that I will pursue, a vision articulated often by President-elect Biden, doubtlessly informed by his time on this committee when he said that the United States is a nation that leads not only by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. If confirmed, three priorities would guide my time as Secretary of State. First, I will work with you to reinvigorate the Department of State, investing in its greatest asset, the Foreign Service officers, the civil servants, the locally employed staff who animate American diplomacy. I know from firsthand experience their passion, their energy, their courage, often far from home, away from loved ones, sometimes in dangerous conditions, exacerbated now by the pandemic. They deserve our full support. If I'm confirmed as Secretary, they will have it. I'm committed to advancing our security and prosperity by building a diplomatic corps that fully represents America in all its talent and in all its diversity, recruiting, retaining, promoting officers with the skills to contend with 21st century challenges and who look like the country we represent, sparing no effort to ensure their safety and well-being, demanding accountability, starting with the Secretary of State, for building a more diverse, inclusive, and nonpartisan workforce. Second, working across government and with partners around the world, we will revitalize American diplomacy to deal with and take on the most pressing challenges of our time. We'll show up again, day in, day out, whenever and wherever Americans' prosperity and security is at stake. And we'll engage the world not as it was, but as it is, a world of rising nationalism, receding democracy, growing rivalry from China and Russia and other authoritarian states, mounting threats to a stable and open international system, and a technological revolution that is reshaping every aspect of our lives, especially in cyberspace. But for all that has changed, I believe some things remain constant. American leadership still matters. The reality is the world simply does not organize itself. When we're not engaged, when we're not leading, then one of two things is likely to happen. Either some other country tries to take our place, but not in a way that's likely to advance our interests and values, or, maybe just as bad, no one does, and then you have chaos. Either way, that does not serve the American people. I believe that humility and confidence should be the flip sides of America's leadership coin. Humility, because we have a great deal of work to do at home to enhance our standing abroad. And humility because most of the world's problems are not about us in the first instance, even as they affect us. And no single country acting alone, even one as powerful as the United States, can fully and effectively address these problems. But we'll also act with confidence, with the confidence that America at its best still has a greater ability than any country on earth to mobilize others for the common good. Guided by these principles, I believe we can and we will overcome the COVID crisis, the greatest shared challenge since World War II. We can outcompete China and remind the world that a government of the people, for the people, can deliver for its people. We can take on the existential threat posed by climate change. We can revitalize our core alliances, force multipliers of our influence around the world. Together, we are far better positioned to counter threats from Russia, Iran, North Korea, and to stand up for democracy and human rights. And in everything we do around the world, I believe that we can and we must ensure that our foreign policy is actually working to deliver for American working families here at home. Let me conclude, if I may, Mr. Chairman, with a word about this institution, whose resilience and determination were on full display in the aftermath of the senseless and searing violence in these halls. Both the President-elect and I believe that we have to restore Congress's traditional role as a partner in our foreign policy making. In recent years, across administrations of both parties, Congress's voice in foreign policy has been diluted and diminished. That doesn't make the executive branch stronger. It makes our country weaker. President-elect Biden believes, and I share his conviction, that no foreign policy can be sustained without the informed consent of the American people. You are the representatives of the American people. You provide that advice and consent. We can only tackle the most urgent challenges we have if we work together, and I am dedicated to doing just that. And so if I'm confirmed, my commitment is to work with each and every one of you on behalf of all Americans. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the consideration. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blinken. And of course, your words about working with us is music to our ears, and we'll be happy to be a partner with you in that regard. So with that, we'll proceed to a round of questions, 10 minutes per senator. I'm going to reserve my time, and I'm going to yield to Senator Menendez.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Blinken, thank you for your statement. During our meeting yesterday, we discussed the department will need to repair and rebuild its relationship with this committee. I think it's after 28 years of doing public foreign policy in the House and the Senate, I've never seen a moment like this in terms of our relationship with the State Department. And having heard your opening statement, I'm confident you understand the importance of a constructive relationship between the Department and Congress. So I just have a few quick questions. I've always asked this of every Secretary of State nominee. I'd like to ask you, if you can answer yes or no, I'd appreciate it. Do you agree that the State Department is accountable to Congress and the American people?
Yes.
Do you commit that the Department will keep this committee fully and currently informed on the Department's activities?
I do.
Do you understand and agree that a constructive relationship between the Department and this committee requires meaningful engagement and consultation with the committee while policies are being developed, not after the fact? And can you commit to ensuring that type of meaningful engagement?
Yes, I do, and I can.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Iran. This is going to be one of the most difficult challenges early on because Iran has accelerated. The maximum pressure campaign did not stop it from its acceleration. We were broken away from our allies. We could not even get from our traditional allies a vote at the United Nations on continuing the arms embargo, and that is not a good recipe to counter Iran. So I think there is a will to work together in a serious diplomatic engagement with Iran, but some of our concerns about the JCPOA, obviously time has lapsed, the sunset is closer. Some of the other issues have come to the fore in terms of the JCPOA, and then you have all of Iran's other destabilizing activities. Some of us have worked, Senator Graham, a member of the committee, and I have worked along with others in thinking about how something along the lines of returning to the JCPOA, but with a commitment, a process by which the Iranians would have to deal with some of the challenges left by the JCPOA and other issues, looking at the possibility of a regional fuel bank so that not only the Iranians but those in the Gulf would be able to participate to receive nuclear fuel for domestic peaceful consumption, but not enrichment. We could diffuse a tinderbox in the region of what these countries are looking now to enrich. Those are some ideas, not the totality of it. Can you give us a sense of where you're looking at with reference to Iran? And as part of that, are you going to proactively reach out to Congress in order to forge such a consensus that can move us together with one voice towards meeting Iran as a challenge?
Thank you very much, Senator. Let me answer the last question first in terms of reaching out, and the answer is yes, absolutely, especially on a policy as challenging as the one that we have to deal with when it comes to Iran. We are much better off if we can try to work through and think through these issues together. And you have my commitment that we intend and will do that. And I look forward to the consultations and conversations that we have. When it comes to Iran, a couple of things. First, President-elect Biden is committed to the proposition that Iran will not acquire a nuclear weapon. And we share, I know, that goal across this committee. An Iran with a nuclear weapon, or on the threshold of having one, with the capacity to build one on short order, would be an Iran that is even more dangerous than it already is when it comes to all of the other malicious activities that it's engaged in, whether it is support for terrorism, whether it is fueling and feeding its proxies, whether it is destabilizing the region. An Iran with a nuclear weapon or with the threshold capacity to build one is an Iran that would act potentially with even greater impunity than it already is. So I think we have an urgent responsibility to do whatever we can to prevent Iran from acquiring a weapon or getting close to the capacity to having the fissile material to break out on short notice. In my judgment, the JCPOA, for whatever its limitations, was succeeding on its own terms in blocking Iran's pathways to producing fissile material for a nuclear weapon on short order. It also featured, and a feature that continues, the most intrusive inspections and monitoring regime in the history of arms control. The challenge we face now is that we pulled out of the agreement. Iran is now taking steps to undo the various constraints that were imposed on it by the agreement. And so it has increased its stockpile of low-enriched uranium. It is now enriching at a higher level. It is deploying centrifuges in ways that were prohibited under the agreement. The result is, based on public reporting, the breakout time, the time it would take Iran to produce enough fissile material for one weapon, has gone from beyond a year, as it was under the JCPOA, to about 3 or 4 months, based at least on public reporting. And that potentially brings us right back to the crisis point that we were reaching before the deal was negotiated. And so the President-elect believes that if Iran comes back into compliance, we would too. But we would use that as a platform with our allies and partners who would once again be on the same side with us to seek a longer and stronger agreement, and also, as you and the Chairman have rightly pointed out, to capture these other issues, particularly with regard to missiles and Iran's destabilizing activities. That would be the objective. Having said that, I think we're a long way from there. We would have to see, once the President-elect is in office, what steps Iran actually takes and is prepared to take. We would then have to evaluate whether they were actually making good if they say they're coming back into compliance with their obligations, and then we would take it from there. But in the first instance, and the last thing I'll say on this, sir, is that yes, we absolutely will consult with you, and not only with you, I think as the Chairman suggested, it's also vitally important that we engage on the takeoff, not the landing, with our allies and with our partners in the region, to include Israel and to include the Gulf countries.
Thank you. Now, so I'm all for stronger and longer, and very much glad to hear that these other issues also the administration will look forward to engage and challenge Iran on. I think those are important. Let me turn to China. Many of us, certainly Senator Romney, since my first meeting with him when he came to the Senate, has made China one of the focal points, and he's right about the challenge that China poses. The chairman talked about his initiative. We, meaning Democrats, introduced a couple of months ago the America Leads Act, which brought all of the relevant committees, finance, on trade, commerce, on technology, armed services, just about everybody, in a comprehensive national strategy to deal with China, which deals with both investments here at home, because some of us believe we must not only confront China, we must compete with China to be successful. Diplomacy, alliances, security, values, and trade to create a truly competitive approach. And I believe this is one of the most significant national security challenges we will have, as well as economic challenges. Can you speak a little bit about, too, how do you see that?
First of all, I've read and applaud the Lees Act, and I have also read the very good report that the chairman did on China, and applaud virtually everything that's in it. I think there's a very strong foundation there upon which to build a bipartisan policy with regard to China. As we look at China, there is no doubt that it poses the most significant challenge of any nation state to the United States in terms of our interests, the interests of the American people. There are, as I see it, rising adversarial aspects to the relationship, certainly competitive ones, and still some cooperative ones when it is in our mutual interest. I think as we're thinking about how to deal with China, and I think this is reflected in the work that the committee has done, we have to start by approaching China from a position of strength, not weakness. And the good news is our ability to do that is largely within our control. Position of strength when we are working with, not denigrating, our allies. That's a source of strength for us in dealing with China. A position of strength when we are engaged and leading in international institutions, not pulling back and ceding the terrain to China to write the rules, the norms, and animate those institutions. A position of strength when we stand up for our values, when human rights are being abused in Xinjiang, or when democracy is being trampled in Hong Kong. Our ability to make the investments in ourselves, as you pointed out, that is a source of strength. The investments as necessary in our military to make sure that we can deter any aggression. All of these things are fully within our control, and if we come together and do them, I think we can then deal with the specific challenges that China poses from that position of strength, not a position of weakness.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Blinken, welcome. Let me start out by saying I got a phone call from a former contact in the Obama-Biden administration. I won't name the individual because I don't want to get that person in trouble. But it was a very welcome phone call. I think to summarize it, it started out saying that we're really in an unsustainable position in this country. We're so grossly divided. And particularly in areas of foreign policy, I mean, the standard saying is politics ought to end at the water's edge. I hope that can be true. I don't think it ever has been completely true, but I think there are some really good areas of agreement. And so it's a very sincere attempt to reach out and say, let's try and focus on areas of agreement. And by the way, as a chairman and ranking member on the European Subcommittee, whether it's Nord Stream 2, the European Energy Security and Diversification Act with Senator Murphy, we found those areas of agreement. So I really want to focus on that because I think that's one of the areas, one of the ways we can try and narrow that divide, which I think is just completely unsustainable in this nation. I think one of the areas I think we can all agree on is the world is a very dangerous and complicated place. And there's just no doubt about it. There's not a whole lot of black and white. There is black and white, but there's a lot of gray areas. And how you address, whether it's Iran or North Korea or China or Russia, these are difficult situations. So I have no doubt that you have just a wealth of knowledge, as did Secretary Kerry. I think there's a difference between knowledge, though, and judgment. And so, in all sincerity, I just really want to talk to you about judgment. And again, I know you take a look at the Trump administration and it's like all bad. I don't think that's true. And so let me start out at what I think are foreign policy accomplishments and see whether or not you agree. First of all, we did get our NATO partners to invest more in NATO. And that's a good thing, right? Do you have any reservations about that?
I do not.
I think the peace or the agreements between Israel and Bahrain and UAE and Sudan and Morocco, those are good things. You're going to want to build on that, correct?
I very much agree.
Just a quick aside, again, knowledge versus judgment, it's something that Secretary Kerry thought was not possible whatsoever. Again, that's a judgment call, I understand that. But it's been proven wrong, and I guess I'm kind of looking for an acknowledgement that maybe past judgments have been overtaken by new knowledge and as times have moved on. One thing pretty near and dear to my heart is the agreement, the economic agreement between Kosovo and Serbia. You know, Wes Mitchell sent me over to Serbia and Kosovo a number of times, and you know, I don't want to take blame for this, but the situation was not improving until Rick Grinnell got involved and came up with the idea, okay, a lot of these things they're not going to agree on, but what they can agree on is economic advancement. And so we got an agreement. That's a good thing, correct?
I agree.
What kind of troubles me about the past record of the Obama-Biden administration, again, dealing with difficult situations, but I just want to give you the opportunity to discuss whether you've had any second thoughts on, for example, what happened in Libya. That's where, and you talked about American leadership, that's where President Obama famously said, we're going to lead from behind. And, you know, the world community kind of blew up Libya. That didn't turn out so well. We had Benghazi. Do you have any second thoughts in terms of what happened with Libya?
I do. And let me, before I address that, Senator, I would like to say I believe that no one, no party has a monopoly on good ideas. And I hope that working together, we can pool all the good ideas from both sides of the aisle to try to advance the security and well-being of the American people abroad. I welcome doing that. Second, and very quickly, I think there are a number of things from where I sat that the Trump administration did beyond our borders that I would applaud. You mentioned a couple of them. The Abraham Accords, absolutely. Now, there's certain commitments that may have been made in the context of getting those countries to normalize relations with Israel that I think we should take a hard look at, and I imagine the committee feels the same way. But the work that was done to push forward on normalization with Israel, I applaud. It makes Israel safer. It makes the region safer. It's a good thing. And yes, I would hope that we could build on that as well. You mentioned the work on Kosovo and Serbia. I applaud that as well. The President-elect, as you know, spent a lot of time on those countries in the past, and I think he shares your conviction that there are things we can do to help move Kosovo forward and also hopefully move Serbia forward. And certainly getting our NATO allies to invest more is a good thing. I think that's shared across administrations and across parties. And finally, let me just say that I also believe that President Trump was right in taking a tougher approach to China. I disagree very much with the way that he went about it in a number of areas, but the basic principle was the right one, and I think that's actually helpful to our foreign policy.
No, I think President Trump opened everybody's eyes in terms of China's malign intent. But again, I want to kind of quickly go through Libya, Syria,
sure.
You know, not providing lethal defensive weaponry to Ukraine. Are those things you've given second thoughts to?
Yes. With regard to Libya, here was the situation we faced. We had Muammar Gaddafi saying that he was going to slaughter like rats those opposing him, including all of the inhabitants of Benghazi. And we faced what looked like the potential for a mass atrocity that was heading our way. And what was unique about the moment was the United Nations supported doing something about it, the Security Council, the partners and allies in the region did, and our allies in Europe did too. Having said that, and so I think the good news from where I sat, and I supported that effort. In fact, I think it's been written about. I was the President-elect's National Security Advisor at the time, and he did not agree with that course of action. And so, but we had the kind of relationship where I was able to say what I thought, and as you noted, we intervened. Here's what I think we misjudged. First, we didn't fully appreciate the fact that one of the things Gaddafi had done over the years was to make sure that there was no possible rival to his power. And as a result, there was no effective bureaucracy, no effective administration in Libya with which to work when he was gone. That made things much more challenging than I think we understood.
Okay, so again, because I want to step, so basically there was no plan afterwards. That's something, that's a lesson you've learned.
I think there was a plan that ran into some reality that unfortunately the result has been that there's been more space in Libya for extremist groups who filled some of the vacuum left by Gaddafi.
Okay, one of the things that Congress did unanimously as we approved $300 million of lethal defensive weaponry for Ukraine. The Obama administration never implemented. The Trump administration did. Do you still disagree with providing that lethal defensive weaponry, or do you think over time now that's been proven to be the correct decision by Congress and the Trump administration?
Senator, I support providing that lethal defensive assistance to Ukraine. In fact, I had the opportunity to write exactly that in the New York Times about 3 years ago.
One of the comments, and this is to prepare for this hearing, and I'm not going to enter this in the record, but my staff did provide me Senator McCain's 2014 floor speech, which I'm sure you've read. It was pretty,
I know it well.
pretty blistering. So one of the reasons I thought I'd kind of give you an opportunity to maybe respond, but the chairman also provided a list of questions, and one of the questions he asked was about Soleimani. I mean, is it a good thing that Soleimani is off the battlefield? And I was surprised because you remain adamant that it did not improve our national security. I mean, I would take the opposite side of that viewpoint. You want to try and explain that one? I mean, I think because he was a mastermind, because he was so effective, because he was responsible for hundreds of American lives lost, I don't see how you can agree that that enhances our national security.
No one is shedding a tear for the demise of Qasem Soleimani. And certainly when I was last in office, I saw firsthand the blood that he had on his hands. So no one regrets the fact that he's no longer there. I think from where I sat, Senator, the question is not whether taking him out was the right thing to do. It was gaming out what might be the consequences and asking ourselves whether, on balance, we would be left safer or not in taking that action. Previous administrations, including the Bush administration and the Obama administration, concluded that we wouldn't be. And I think what we saw after his death, including attacks on our positions in Iraq that left dozens, if not hundreds, of Americans with brain injuries, the fact that our forward posts in Iraq that were there to prevent the reemergence of ISIL had to pull back because of concerns that Iranian-backed militia, after Soleimani's death, would attack them. The fact that we are talking about, apparently, closing our embassy in Baghdad, again, for fear of the actions of these militia, and the fact that we've seen Iran acting out in a whole variety of ways, because we're not the only actor in this drama. I think, on balance, that action actually left us less safe, not more safe.
Well, he was in Baghdad for a reason, probably to plan further attacks. So we don't know what he might have done, but I appreciate your answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let's move to Senator Cardin, I believe, is joining us online. Senator Cardin, are you there?
So my question to you is whether you are prepared to make the preservation of democracy, good governance, human rights, and anti-corruption a priority, a top priority within the State Department, which requires the use of resources devoted to protecting democracy, whether it's at USAID or whether it's the resources in our missions in each of our countries that will be made a priority to help preserve democracies around the world and the protection of human rights and anti-corruption activities.
Senator, first of all, it's good to see you. And the short answer is yes, absolutely. The President-elect's been very clear that our charge would be to put democracy and human rights back at the center of American foreign policy. And we intend to do just that. That is a question of resources. It's a question of focus. It's a question of commitment. Of course, a lot of this begins at home. Our ability to be a strong leader for and defender of democracy and human rights also depends, to a large extent, on the strength of our own democracy here at home. And as we've already discussed, we have some work to do on that account. You're absolutely right when you cite the backsliding we've seen. Freedom House has been tracking this, as many of you know, for decades. And of the 40 or so countries that were ranked, consistently ranked, fully free in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, fully half of them have been backsliding on democratic metrics. And so this poses a real challenge. One of the goals that the President-elect has set for us is to try to convene a summit of democracies within the first year of his administration, to bring democratic countries together, to think together, both about some of the challenges that we face at home that are common to democracies, including rising populism, but also to think about a common agenda as we're dealing with the work of defending and advancing democracy around the world, to include combating corruption, to include standing up more effectively for human rights, to include having a united voice in calling out abuses of democracy or abuses of human rights. This is something that I hope we'll be able to put together toward the end of this year, and something that we would very much welcome the participation of members of Congress, and particularly members of this committee.
Thank you for that. I would also urge you to be as aggressive as you can with the budget director as to resources being devoted to democracy, because it's been a very small slice of USAID's budget, and just in the mission support is not as strong as I think it should be. I'm going to talk about one of the tools that has gotten the most international attention, that is the Magnitsky sanctions. It was interesting that it's been reported that was the first issue brought up by Mr. Putin when he met with President Trump. Are you committed to working with us to strengthen the Magnitsky global sanction regime to go against those actors that are not held accountable in their own states for those violations of human rights and corruption?
Yes, I am. And I should just add that I think this has been a great achievement, Senator, of yours and of this committee. We've gone from Magnitsky to global Magnitsky to different countries now adopting their own Magnitsky-like laws, and now just recently the European Union. So I think this has been a tremendous success story in actually bringing the democratic countries of the world together and giving them an effective tool to actually push back against abuses of democracy and human rights.
In regards to Magnitsky, to deal with the sunset that's provided in the statute currently, to remove that, but also to strengthen some of the areas. There are ways that we can strengthen the global Magnitsky through the State Department, getting more countries to adopt global Magnitsky statutes, to make sure they're comprehensive, include corruption, and to make sure you have adequate staffing so that you can implement the law fully. I would also recommend that you follow the leads given to us by NGOs that in many cases have information that otherwise would not be made available to us to hold abusers accountable. I think these are all suggestions that can help strengthen the Magnitsky statute and our messages against international human rights violators.
Yep.
I want to mention one other area where I think we can make tremendous progress during your tenure, and that is on anti-corruption. We've all acknowledged that corruption is a national security threat. Corruption exists in every country, but unless you have a plan to deal with corruption, it becomes very corrosive to the underlying fabric of any democratic society. So I've introduced legislation with Senator Young that we use the model of the trafficking in persons that we do, where we evaluate every country in the world, including the United States, as to how well they're dealing with ridding trafficking of humans. We set up a similar regime for corruption, where we identify the problems we have in countries with corruption and put them on a tier rating of consequences. I've talked to the Biden transition team about this, this is legislation that did pass our committee and passed the Senate in the last Congress. It was not enacted into law. Will you work with us so that we can have a very strong position in making it clear that every country can do better with fighting corruption, but there are certain standards that need to be met?
Yes, absolutely. I'd welcome that if confirmed. And beyond that, we want to elevate the work in combating corruption at the State Department. That's something I'd welcome talking to you about.
Thank you. Cover, if I might, your strategies in regards to the U.S.-Israel relations. We know that there has been strong support for the special relationship between Israel and the United States. We know that we need to maintain America's leadership in regards to that relationship because Israel has been marginalized in so many places and so many organizations around the world. You already mentioned the Abraham Accords. How do you intend to try to get back on track the Israel-Palestinian negotiations, where we know the only way for lasting peace in the Middle East is two states living side by side in peace, the Jewish state and a Palestinian state?
Thank you, Senator. First, let me start with this very basic proposition, which is that our commitment to Israel's security is sacrosanct. And this is something that the President-elect feels very strongly. His very first trip, when he was a member of this committee, as a senator, his first foreign trip was to Israel. He met with a prime minister by the name of Golda Meir. She had a young aide by the name of Yitzhak Rabin, and he has worked with every Israeli prime minister since then. And so the foundation of our relationship is support for Israel's security. Having said that, the President-elect believes, and I share this conviction, that the best way and maybe the only way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish democratic state and to give the Palestinians the state to which they are entitled is through the so-called two-state solution, obviously a solution that is very challenged at this moment. I think realistically, it's hard to see near-term prospects for moving forward on that. In the first instance, what would be important is to make sure that neither party takes steps that make the already difficult proposition even more challenging, and certainly avoids unilateral actions that makes that more challenging. And then hopefully to start working to slowly build some confidence on both sides to create an environment in which we might once again be able to help advance a solution to the Israel and Palestinian relationship.
Thank you. And of course, we have strong support in Congress, as you've seen by our actions. And I do think Congress working with the administration, we should be able to advance the process. One last question dealing with Central America. You talked about corruption. Senator Biden, Vice President Biden, had a game plan to try to deal with the corruption in Central America in a way for good governance that provided opportunities that would help against the migration, people wanting to live because of fear of gangs, etc. Is there a game plan for how you're going to deal with Central America?
There is, and I think, as you rightly point out, at the end of the Obama-Biden administration, toward the end, then Vice President Biden worked very closely with Congress, with this committee, to develop a plan to deal with the challenges posed by the systemic and endemic problems in the Northern Triangle countries, in Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador. And these drivers, of course, were the primary drivers of migration crisis that continues to challenge us to this very day. So getting at some of the root causes that are causing people to make that incredibly difficult decision to pick up one day, leave everything they know behind, leave their families, their country, their culture, their language behind, because life is simply not tolerable in its present circumstance. If we don't help these countries address those causes, it's going to be very hard to get at the root of the problem. And so there was a bipartisan plan put forward that passed Congress with about $800 million to help countries in the Northern Triangle, but not simply throwing money at them, but tying the assistance we were providing to concrete reforms that they would take in the criminal justice system, in combating corruption, in creating greater economic opportunity, et cetera. And we began to see some, I think, progress in each of those countries as a result of this assistance and coordination. Unfortunately, that plan went into abeyance in the last few years, and we will come forward to talk to you about a renewed effort at a bigger scale that involves assistance for the Northern Triangle countries, but again, assistance tied to concrete, demonstrable reforms.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And again, thank you for your service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to be associated also with the comments you made at the opening of this session, also the comments of Ranking Member Menendez, as well as the questions which he asked. And I'd like to indicate my concurrence also with the comments made by Mr. Blinken as he began. A number of things stood out. One was his conviction, which I share, that we be involved in the world, because the world is a safer place if we are involved in the world. And I think something we sometimes lose in our discussion of this involvement is that doesn't mean necessarily military engagement in the world. It means promoting our values, our economic interests, and so forth. And we're involved in the world because it is good for America. Not just good for the world, but it's good for us and for the people of America. And I applaud that recognition. I want to begin with some thoughts about China and think for the committee as well as for the American public that's watching this. If you'd perhaps describe for us what China has described as their ambition over this century, what they intend to achieve, and how the world would be different if they were successful in doing so.
Thank you very much, Senator. China had a policy for decades of, as they described it, hiding their hand and biding their time in terms of asserting their interests beyond China's borders, leaving aside what they were doing within their borders. And I think what we've seen in recent years, particularly since the rise of Xi Jinping as the leader, has been that the hiding and biding has gone away, and they are much more assertive in making clear that they seek to become, in effect, the leading country in the world, the country that sets the norms, that sets the standards, and to put forward a model that they hope other countries and people will ascribe to. And, Senator, my own conviction is that there are many very apparent weaknesses that China continues to try to hide when it comes to projecting its model. But in the absence of an alternative, they may do better than we think. And so I think our obligation is to demonstrate that the vision that we have, the policies we pursue, and the way we do it is much more effective in actually delivering for our people, as well as for people around the world, to make sure that our model is the one that carries the day. If we're pulling back from the world, if we're pulling back from the institutions, if we're pulling back from playing that lead role in shaping the rules and the norms, that gives them a free field to redefine the century more on their terms than on ours. One of the ways, this is just one example, but I think one of the ways we see this acutely is there's an increasing divide between what you might call techno-democracies, that is technologically sophisticated countries that are also democracies, and techno-autocracies like China. And whether the techno-democracies or the techno-autocracies are the ones that get to define how technology is used, the technology that dominates all of our lives, I think is going to go a long way towards shaping the next decades. We have a very strong interest in making sure that the techno-democracies come together more effectively so that we are the ones who are doing the shaping of those norms and rules. And to the extent technology can be infused with values, that these are more our values than theirs. But there is no doubt that I think China would like to recapture its extraordinary past, but to do so in a way that is potentially and very practically, as we're seeing already, inimical to our own values and our own interests.
Yeah, I think my own view is that their ambition is to become the geopolitical leader of the world, as well as the economic leader of the world, the military leader of the world, and ultimately to impose their authoritarian views in such a way that would put in great risk the freedom and liberty of people here and around the world. How does Taiwan and our commitments to Taiwan figure in your thinking with regards to our interests in the region?
There's been a strong and long bipartisan commitment to Taiwan, the Taiwan Relations Act, also the communiques with China. And part of that commitment is making sure that Taiwan have the ability to defend itself against aggression. And that is a commitment that will absolutely endure in a Biden administration. We will make sure that Taiwan has the ability to do that. I'd also like to see Taiwan playing a greater role around the world, including in international organizations. When those organizations don't require the status of a country to be a member, they should become members. When it does, there are other ways that they can participate. And I think our own engagement with Taiwan should be looked at, and indeed that's being done. As you know, some regulations were promulgated by the outgoing Secretary of State. We're going to take a hard look at those pursuant to the Taiwan Assurance Act, and we will look at that. I had the opportunity, Senator, when President Tsai was running for office, to actually receive her as a candidate at the State Department when I was last there. I spoke to her a number of times when she became president, and I was Deputy Secretary of State. But the commitment to Taiwan is something that we hold to very strongly.
India has perhaps begun to see China in a new light, not only because of the border dispute, which led to the death of many Indian military individuals. They've indicated an openness to work with us with actually in military preparations as well and war games. How can we strengthen our ties with India and strengthen their resolve to defend democratic interests in the region?
I think India has been very much a bipartisan success story over successive administrations. It started with, toward the end of the Clinton administration, after the nuclear tests, when relations were put back on a better footing. Under President Bush, we secured a peaceful nuclear cooperation agreement with India. Then Senator Biden led the efforts at this committee to get that through Congress. And then I think during the Obama administration, we deepened cooperation with India, particularly in the defense procurement area, also on information sharing. And I think the Trump administration has carried that forward, including with this concept of an Indo-Pacific, and to make sure that we were working with India so that no country in the region, including China, could challenge its sovereignty, and also working with it on concerns that we share about terrorism. So I think there are many ways in which we can deepen that cooperation to pursue the path that successive administrations have put us on. One area I think that has a lot of promise and maybe even necessity is actually climate. At the current rate things are going, India is poised over the next 2 or 3 decades to catch up to China in terms of the emissions that it produces. At the same time, as you know, Prime Minister Modi has been a very strong advocate for looking at renewable energy and different technologies. I think there's a very strong potential for our countries to work together in that area.
Thank you. That does raise the question of what it's going to be like to serve in an administration where former Secretary Kerry is going to be working with you. I hope that you're never tempted to give in your strategy with regards to China in order to obtain a climate advantage that Secretary Kerry might be promoting. So your State Department commitment to confront China, I think, is a great significance and hopefully the priority. Let me turn to another topic which was raised by Senator Johnson appropriately, which is a number of accomplishments of the Trump administration shouldn't be lost and in the foreign policy arena. One of those that is perhaps questionable by members in this committee relates to the JCPOA with regards to Iran. I, like Senator Menendez, was not supportive of the JCPOA and wrote a column suggesting that it was a mistake to enter into. My concern was that it allowed Iran to eventually have a nuclear weapon, or have the capacity to have a nuclear weapon. And my view was that an agreement should only be reached if it prevented Iran forever from having a nuclear weapon. And I would only suggest that before the administration takes a posture with regards to the JCPOA, that there be a very careful review of intelligence to determine just what the state is of Iran right now with regards to the health of its leaders, with regards to the fragility of its economy, because there may well be a potential to take a more aggressive stance than might have been anticipated, and hope that you will give due consideration to not just reversing policies of the prior administration, but perhaps taking advantage of some things done by the prior administration that may prevent an opportunity that we might otherwise not be able to recognize.
I welcome having the opportunity to do that, to plunge into the intelligence if confirmed, and then also to working on that with you and other members of this committee.
Thank you, Mr. Blinken.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Blinken, thank you for being willing to consider being nominated to this important post at this critical time, and for being here today. One of the things we've heard in the last few days is the President-elect Biden's interest in resuming the United States' position in a number of international alliances, from everything from the Paris Climate Accords to the WHO. But clearly it's going to take more than that to rebuild our relationships around the world. So what else do we need to do, and what are you thinking about, as if you're confirmed, that you think is going to be important to restoring those relationships?
Senator, I think we have and several members of the committee have already alluded to this, we do have a big task ahead of us in restoring, revitalizing those relationships. I do think it starts, to use a colloquial term, with showing up again, with being present, with having our diplomats engaged in the painstaking, sometimes not very glamorous, hard work of day in, day out diplomacy, and being in the room, not pulling back from it. And I know sometimes that sounds trite, but I just think that we are so much better off, even in institutions and organizations that are clearly imperfect and need reform. We're, as a general rule, much better off being at the table than being outside the room, if we're going to try to influence those institutions and organizations and move them in a better direction. So I think you will see in a Biden administration that kind of engagement, that kind of leadership. I think it's also fair to say that some of our allies and partners question the sustainability of our commitments based on the experience of of recent years. And that's going to be a hard hill to climb, and they're going to have to make their own calculations about that. But I think it comes down to this. One is, and maybe this is an obligation that I think all of us share who are in this line of work. Part of our challenge, I think, is to connect what all of us are doing to the lives of the American people. Because if we want to have their support for American leadership, American engagement in the world, we have to demonstrate that it is actually making an improvement in their lives or preventing something bad from happening. And I think COVID-19, to some extent, has maybe brought that home as nothing else has in recent years, going back to 9/11. But there's so many other areas where what we're doing around the world connects directly to the lives that our fellow citizens are leading, and I think we need to make those connections. That'll give us a stronger foundation upon which to build an engaged foreign policy, and in turn one that's, I think, sustainable and that our partners and allies recognize as such. Last word on this. I think one of the things that we all have in common with our democratic partners and allies is the recognition that most of the challenges we face, as I mentioned earlier, simply can't be addressed effectively by any one country acting alone, even the United States. And so whether it's a global pandemic, whether it is a changing climate, whether it's the spread of bad weapons, you name it, all of these things demand international cooperation and coordination. And I believe that if we're stepping up and playing the role that we played in the past, but focused on the problems of today and tomorrow, we'll actually get a receptive audience to work with us.
Well, I certainly agree with that, and agree with the importance of robust diplomatic efforts. And given the discussion about China and this afternoon, it seems to me that we ought to look at what China is doing in terms of their increase in investments in diplomacy, their opening consulates around the world, their focus on economic assistance for other countries, because right now they're eating our lunch, and we better do better if we're going to be able to compete, continue to compete. When you and I had the opportunity to talk a couple of weeks ago, which I very much appreciated, but one of the things we talked about were the attacks on our diplomatic personnel in Cuba and China and some other locations. And I and a number of other senators have continuously asked the State Department and Secretary Pompeo to provide information about those attacks, about what caused them, about our response to them, to make sure that our personnel are all treated fairly. And we were able to get some language into the defense bill that passed this year to do that. But we still have not seen all of the information that's available. Will you commit to being transparent with us about what's going on with those attacks and getting to the bottom of who's responsible and sharing that information with Congress and with the public where it's appropriate?
Yes, absolutely. And Senator, if I can just say first that your leadership on this issue, that of Senator Rubio, I know has been deeply appreciated within the department. I had some opportunity to get briefed on a few issues during this transition and nomination period, and one of the ones I asked for immediately was to get everything we knew about the so-called Havana syndrome and these attacks. And so I've read the reports. I was briefed on it. I welcome an opportunity to come and, if confirmed, to talk to all of you about it. Priority is making sure that our diplomats are safe and secure, but also that we find out who's responsible if a state actor or others are responsible, having accountability and making sure that we put the protections in place so that our folks are safe and secure. Would welcome working with the committee on that.
Good. I hope Senators Risch and Menendez that we can make that happen with this committee in the next month or so. Another topic we talked about briefly was the importance of ensuring that women are part of our foreign policy agenda. And I'm very proud to have worked on legislation to try and include women at the table when we're negotiating conflicts and to ensure that they're part of those efforts, because the data shows us that when that's the case, those kinds of peace negotiations have a 35% chance of lasting 15 years or longer. 35% better chance of lasting 15 years or longer. So it's something that makes sense. And I would hope, again, that the State Department would take more robust effort to be engaged in that. The Defense Department has, I think, been more proactive in that, and I hope that the state will join in those efforts in the coming year. But one of the areas where it's clearly an issue is in Afghanistan, and we have not gotten any commitment from the Taliban on the role of women in any future Afghan state post peace talks. So I wonder if you could talk about what you think we should be saying to the Taliban.
First, Senator, I couldn't agree more with the larger point you were making, and that is very much a lens that we would intend to put on our foreign policy and on the work of the State Department. And again, would welcome the opportunity to work with you on that. When it comes to Afghanistan, we have a real challenge there, to state the obvious. First, yes, we want to end this so-called forever war. We want to bring our forces home. We want to retain some capacity to deal with any resurgence of terrorism, which is what brought us there in the first place. And we have to look carefully at what has actually been negotiated. I haven't been privy to it yet, particularly with regard to the agreement that was reached in the first instance between the United States and the Taliban, to understand fully what commitments were made or not made by the Taliban, and then to see where they get in their negotiations with the government of Afghanistan. I don't believe that any outcome that they might achieve, the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban, is sustainable without protecting the gains that have been made by women and girls in Afghanistan over the last 20 years when it comes to access to education, to health care, to employment. And so I think we have a strong interest, if that agreement is actually, if there is an agreement, if it's going to hold up, to do what we can to make sure that those rights are preserved. But I would acknowledge to you I don't think that's going to be easy, but we will work on it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I intend to ask General Austin the same question at his hearing this afternoon. Can you finally, I know I'm almost out of time, but can you talk about what our response to Putin's taken into custody Mr. Navalny should be, and how we continue to put pressure on Russia?
It is extraordinary how frightened Vladimir Putin seems to be of one man. I think that speaks volumes. And Mr. Navalny is a voice, I think, for millions and millions and millions of Russians, and their voice needs to be heard in Russia. And the attempts to silence that voice by silencing Mr. Navalny is something that we strongly condemn, and we've spoken to it, and will continue to do so. I would say more broadly, and this is probably a subject for ongoing conversation, we've talked about a number of challenges. The challenge posed by Russia across a whole series of fronts is also one that is urgent. I have to say that I think members of this committee, particularly Senator Romney, have been very prescient when it comes to the challenge posed to us by Russia. There's a lot to be discussed and talked about there, but this is very high on the agenda for an incoming administration.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Blinken, for being here. Thanks for your willingness to step back in and serve our country. We always should appreciate that for anyone who's willing to step up and do it. Obviously, everyone's asking about all the different parts of the world. I care about a lot of them, so I'm going to focus, if I can, on the Western Hemisphere for a moment. Two specific things. The first is, as you're well aware, in Cuba, there is a very small but not real large or substantial small private businesses. The bulk of the economic activity in that country is controlled by a holding company named Gaesa, which controls basically anything that makes money. And they've actually, anytime they figure out something might make money, they pull it into that. Gaesa is controlled by the Cuban military and military officials. And the current administration, the Trump administration, put in place a policy that prohibits financial transactions with any of those companies that are controlled by that holding company owned by the Cuban military. And so, theoretically, if the Cuban government would allow it, an independent Cuban can open up a restaurant, a hotel, or business and interact and have transactions, but not a company controlled by the Cuban military as identified through that holding company. Is that a policy that you would recommend to the Biden administration that we keep, or not?
Senator, I would propose to review that very, very quickly. In terms of the objectives that you cite, that makes very good sense to me. I think the question is, and I don't know enough to form a full judgment as to whether it is, in fact, achieving those objectives, and are there any other costs or consequences that we might want to look at. But certainly the objective strikes me as exactly the right one. I'd welcome an opportunity, if confirmed, to actually talk to you about that. And by the way, about our approach to Cuba more broadly.
On the issue of, as a matter of theory, because obviously the Cuban government we can open up whatever we want to them, but the Cuban government controls what they allow and what they don't allow. So as an example, if an individual Cuban decided to borrow money from a relative in the United States and open up a business, they could do so under existing law, potentially, depending on how the transaction was structured, but the Cuban government wouldn't allow it. And in fact, they've cracked down on that. So I think we could agree, could we not, that to the extent that it involves economic independence for Cubans individuals or companies that they're allowed to start, that's one thing. But when it comes to these entities that are not state-controlled entities, they're oligarchs that control it, basically one individual, largely because they want to be not just a politically totalitarian state, but also an economic totalitarian state. that it would further the national interest of the United States to encourage more economic independence for the individual and less dependence on the state that gives them all this leverage over them. So I do sincerely hope that just because these were Trump policies, and I'm not claiming that that's what you're saying, that we don't just throw the whole thing out and say, let's go back into the Obama policy, that even some of the architects of it have since conceded could have been structured a little differently because they were unilateral and didn't lead to some of the results we thought. I do think as you carefully review many of the steps that have been taken, there is a logic and a rationale behind each of them that I hope that will be taken into account. I think it serves our national interest to do so. On Venezuela, I'm sure you're well aware that Maduro has repeatedly, over the course of the last 5 to 7 years, utilized negotiations as a delay tactic. It's so egregious that even the Vatican says we're not having any more negotiations. In fact, in a very strongly worded letter from the Pope to him said, you remember the last time we met, I'm paraphrasing, remember the last time we met, you agreed to things, you never did any of them, there's no purpose in meeting anymore. Effort after effort to negotiate with Maduro's regime for whatever have all resulted in nothing. He uses it to buy time and to delay, and he uses it to divide the opposition. And unfortunately, multiple players have fallen into that trap. The reality of it is that he will agree to all sorts of short-term reversible things, release a political prisoner or what have you. But at the end of the day, he's not ever going to agree to free and fair elections because he can't win them. Is it your view that that our stance towards Venezuela should change in essence, that we should no longer recognize Juan Guaido and enter into negotiations with Maduro?
No, it is not. I very much agree with you, Senator, first of all, with regard to a number of the steps that were taken toward Venezuela in recent years, including recognizing Mr. Guaido, recognizing the National Assembly as the only democratically elected institution in Venezuela, seeking to increase pressure on the regime led by a brutal dictator in Maduro, as well as to try to work with some of our allies and partners. The hard part is that for all of those efforts, which I support, we obviously have not gotten the results that we need. And one of the things I would really welcome doing, if confirmed, is to come and talk some of that through with you and with others on this committee, because we need an effective policy that can restore Venezuela to democracy, starting with free and fair elections, and how can we best advance that ball. I think there's some things that we can look at, particularly better, stronger coordination and cooperation with like-minded countries. Maybe we need to look at how we more effectively target the sanctions that we have so that regime enablers really feel the pain of those sanctions. And certainly, I believe there's more that we need to try to do in terms of humanitarian assistance, given the tremendous suffering of the Venezuelan people, as well as helping some of the neighboring countries that have borne the brunt of refugees from Venezuela. But I'd welcome an opportunity, if confirmed, to talk to you about that.
Yeah, and I would just encourage that every time we talk about issues like Venezuela, that it's important we point to the direct national interest of the United States in the matter, because I think sometimes people start to get the imagery that this is about nation building or picking sides in an internal dispute. The reason why the U.S. cares about of course, we care about democracy, we care a lot about human rights, but there is a direct national interest to the United States involved. You have a regime that openly houses and gives safe harbor to multiple terrorist organizations like the FARC and the ELN that traffic drugs, that in turn threaten to destabilize and even potentially topple at some point or seriously threaten the government of Colombia, which would be a massive blow to regional stability and ultimately impacts us as well. It's already having a migratory pressure on this country, but on countries in the region, in Peru and Brazil and Colombia, which ultimately also impacts us. They have very friendly relations, military and otherwise, with the Russians, and increased evidence of Iranian interest and activity, including the sale of oil or gasoline in exchange for gold that they're stealing from their reserve. So I just encourage you to constantly point to the fact that this is not just a do-gooder effort here. There is a direct national security interest to the United States involved in what happens there. You may have been asked this already, but I think it's important. Would you acknowledge, as I think a growing number of people have, that there was once here a bipartisan consensus on China, that once they got rich and they got prosperous, they would become more like us, that
Yes.
that consensus was flawed?
I think we've found that out in practice. Yes, I think there was a broad consensus that economic liberalization in China would lead to political liberalization. That has not happened.
Well, beyond the political liberalization, their intent was never, it goes deeper, that it goes to a dangerous imbalance that's now developed in the relationship on a commercial front, on a geopolitical front, and increasingly, potentially on a military front. You've seen a massive expansion of a military capability, both technological and particularly in the asymmetric abilities that they have that really have no precedent. And it is now clear that they are making the argument to the world, and frankly and unfortunately, we domestically have helped them make this argument, that American-style democracy is too chaotic and that what we have here, them, the Communist Party of China, is much more stable and a much better model to follow. The bottom line is, and I know that this is people like to throw around the phrases like Cold War. I think this is very different than the Cold War. But do you have any doubt in your mind that the goal of the Chinese Communist Party is to be the world's predominant political, geopolitical, military, and economic power, and for the United States to decline in relation?
I do not.
You have no doubt?
I have no doubt.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. I am told that Senator Coons is with us electronically. Is that true?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you. Oh, now I can see you. There you are. Welcome, Senator Coons. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Menendez. Thank you so much for a chance to be with you, Tony. It is great to be with you again. Thank you to you and your family, to Evan and John and Lila, for your willingness to serve once again. Given your previous experience as Deputy Secretary of State, Deputy National Security Advisor, as the staff director of this important committee, you have excellent experience and credentials, and in your opening statement, you once again reinforced the ways in which your life experience, your values, reinforce all the ways in which you will be an excellent Secretary of State for this nation. I'm sorry not to be with you in person. I was here for the send-off celebration as the President-elect departed Delaware and headed towards Washington to begin the inauguration. But it has been exciting to me to have a chance to hear my colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, raise challenging issues and to hear your engaged and thoughtful and forward-looking answers. We gather today at a moment when it is a real challenge for all of us that the events of last Wednesday highlighted some of the deep divisions in our country and some of the challenges our democracy faces. And I am hopeful that after a National Day of Service yesterday celebrating Martin Luther King Day, after this evening's national reflection on all the American lives that have been lost in this COVID pandemic, and after tomorrow's inauguration, that we can begin the work of investing in our democracy, rebuilding our bipartisan consensus around some of the challenges facing us in the world, and to do that in partnership with you. Let me first start with something that's been the topic of many questions from colleagues, the U.S.-China relationship and how that in many ways will define this century. I very much look forward to working with the incoming chairman and ranking member of this committee, with you, Mr. Blinken, and with many of my colleagues in figuring out how we craft a durable, a sustainable, and effective, and a bipartisan strategy with regards to China. You've made reference, Tony, to the techno-democracies and techno-autocracies of the world, and the ways in which there is an intersection between concerns about digital privacy, digital promotion of democracy, intellectual property, and ways in which China's bad behavior on the world stage with regards to IP is laying the groundwork for them to successfully export their model of digital authoritarianism. Do you think in confronting China's digital authoritarianism, we should make that a part of the agenda of our convening a global group of digital democracy, something like the D10 that Prime Minister Boris Johnson has proposed, Or do you think we should pursue something with more weight, a regional structure, like a digital free trade zone of democracies aligned like the United States in order to help keep emerging technologies free and available and open to the world?
My sense is everything should be on the table. It may be something that requires multiple steps to get to the destination. In the first instance, bringing concerned countries together, the digital democracies together, in an appropriate forum, I think is the place to start. And I don't want to minimize the challenge. We obviously have disagreements among democracies about a lot of profound questions about how technology is used. So we've got some work to do just to get our own collective house in order. But I think you start there, and then some of the more expansive ideas, Senator, that you alluded to is something that we might be able to get to and work toward.
I'd be excited to do that work with you. Senator Menendez, Senator Risch, a number of colleagues raised concerns about Iran and Iran's aggressive pursuit, both regionally of influence of their ballistic missile program and of their restarting their more robust enrichment program and the threat that that poses to the region and to our security. I also just want to renew my commitment to the U.S.-Israel relationship and to trying to pursue some positive path towards a two-state solution. The Middle East as a region remains as unsettled and unstable as it's ever been, although there was progress in some of the normalization aspects of the Abraham Accords that you have recognized. The administration will face real challenges in assessing Iran's willingness to negotiate in good faith and the path forward. I look forward to working with you on this challenge and making sure that we build a framework with our core allies in Europe that can take into account these broader destabilizing actions by Iran. Let me ask quickly about two other things going on in the region that haven't been addressed so far. Recently, outgoing Secretary Pompeo designated the Houthi movement in Yemen as a foreign terrorist organization. Many humanitarian leaders, including the head of the World Food Program and senators on both sides of the aisle, denounced that designation as something that may well create now a humanitarian crisis of greater scale. The president-elect has said he would end U.S. support for the war in Yemen and that U.S. support for humanitarian relief is critical. What steps do you think we can or should immediately take with regards to Yemen? How can the Senate help? And how do you see this as a piece of that broader regional puzzle of working through pushing back on Iran's projection of force through proxies while still re-examining some of our relationships in the region that have become more complicated by their human rights records?
First, Senator, we need to be clear-eyed about the Houthis. They in Yemen, they engaged in a path of aggression through the country. They directed aggression toward Saudi Arabia. They've committed atrocities and human rights abuses, and that is a fact. What's also a fact, though, is that the Saudi-led campaign in Yemen to push back against the Houthi aggression has contributed to what is, by most accounts, the worst humanitarian situation that we face anywhere in the world. And one aspect of that situation is that about 80% of the Yemeni population right now is in areas controlled by the Houthis. And whether we like it or not, we have to find ways to get assistance to them if we're going to do anything about addressing this situation. And so my concern, deep concern about the designation that was made is that, at least on its surface, it seems to achieve nothing particularly practical in advancing the efforts against the Houthis and to bring them back to the negotiating table, while making it even more difficult than it already is to provide humanitarian assistance to people who desperately need it. So I think we would propose to review that immediately to make sure that what we are doing is not impeding the provision of humanitarian assistance even under these difficult circumstances. I recognize that some have talked about carve-outs for American providers of humanitarian assistance. The problem there is that if the carve-outs don't apply to everyone around the world, it's not going to get the job done, because most of the humanitarian assistance provided to Yemen is not coming from the United States, it's coming from other countries. So I think we've got a very specific and concrete problem that we need to address very quickly if we're going to make sure we're doing everything we can to alleviate the suffering of people in Yemen.
Thank you for that answer. I need to move forward given the limitations of time. I was proud to have a chance to work with a number of colleagues on this committee in 2018 to help pass the BUILD Act that created the new Development Finance Corporation. In 2019, the Global Fragility Act, which set a new process and framework for looking at fragile states, borrowing from the lessons of Plan Colombia. One of the areas, as we both know, the president-elect has been passionate about is the Northern Triangle and finding ways to build a sustained long-term strategy that can secure stability in a region that has long known fragility. And at the end of last year, we passed a bipartisan package that creates the Nidaloe Middle East Partnership for Peace Fund to provide support for partnership between Palestinians and Israelis to provide for economic ventures and opportunity. Are these three tools that you look forward to working with us on and that you will embrace in your leadership role as the Biden administration looks for new tools to use in advancing our broader objectives?
Yes.
Yeah. And can you help me understand from your view the challenge of combating fragility and putting prioritization in place between diplomacy, defense, and development?
First, Senator, I think the Fragility Act is a terrific foundation upon which to do this. I've had some conversations with the President-elect about exactly this, and it is very much on his mind. That is the risks that continue to be posed emanating from fragile states and the national security interests that we have, as well as the humanitarian one, in doing what we can to help strengthen fragile states and prevent fragile states from becoming failed states. And I think you put in place a very good foundation for thinking about that. And of course, part of this is making sure that our development programs are fully and thoroughly integrated into our foreign policy, making sure that they are delivering and effective, because we are conscious that we're using the taxpayers' money in advancing them, but also making sure that we put these front and center, that they are not an afterthought, they're actually the first thought, along with our diplomacy, in our foreign policy.
And I think the Development Finance Corporation provides a critical new tool as long as it is a development finance corporation. Let me just, a number of colleagues have referenced Russia and the tragic arrest of Navalny and the importance of advancing human rights and supporting the fight for democracy, whether it's in failed authoritarian states like Venezuela, or it's in Putin's Russia, or it's elsewhere in the world. You know my long concern for Africa. There was just a deeply flawed election in Uganda, where Museveni has again held on to power in no small part by engaging in a blatant disregard for human rights. There are other countries of real concern in Ethiopia, the violence in the Tigray region, in Sudan, on the other hand, where there's been an encouraging transition to democracy recently. How do you plan to better support the fragile transition in Sudan while pushing back on those countries that are backsliding on their commitment to democracy, like Uganda, or some would argue Ethiopia?
So I think it starts with our very active engagement, not being AWOL when these problems emerge. Ethiopia, I share your deep concerns. We have seen a number of deeply concerning actions taken, including atrocities directed both at people in Tigray, directed at Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia. We, I think, need to see much greater access to the region, accountability, an effort to put a dialogue in place so that the issues that cause the conflict can actually be discussed and litigated as opposed to dealt with through violence. We need to see a restoration of communications. We need access for humanitarian assistance in the region. And I worry as well that what started there has the potential to be destabilizing throughout the Horn of Africa. So I would like to see American diplomacy fully engaged in trying to contend with this challenge. You cited a number of other places where we have, I share your concerns about the elections in Uganda, concerns in Cameroon recently, particularly violence directed at the Anglophone population. So there are a whole series of places where we have challenges where I think the United States can help make a difference, and that starts with being engaged.
Thank you, Senator Coons.
If I can just in closing say, I share your commitment to a diverse workforce in the State Department. and to ensuring that the State Department has the resources it needs to do its job well. I could not agree more, Tony, with your statement that we have to connect foreign policy to the lived daily concerns of average working people across this country. You will be an excellent leader in doing so, and I very much look forward to supporting your nomination and to working with you. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Next up is Senator Graham, and after that will be Senator Murphy. However, between the two, and after Senator Graham, we're going to take a humanitarian break for about 10 minutes since we've been at it for a couple of hours. So you're holding up well, Mr. Blinken, but we don't want you to wither. So we'll take a break after Senator Graham's, as usual, poignant questions. Senator Graham.
Thank you. I'll try to make sure that I don't violate the Geneva Convention here. The one thing I want to say is I think you're an outstanding choice by President-elect Biden. I've known you for a long time. I think you're loyal to the president. I think you understand the world. We have different viewpoints on certain issues, but to me, the whole point of this is to nominate qualified people, get them in place as quick as possible, reach agreement where you can, and disagree when you must. So Senator Coons and I are going to be working together on the State Department appropriations account. You have my complete support. The people at the State Department are incredibly patriotic. They live in dangerous places doing very dangerous things. They don't get the notoriety they deserve. So I'm just a big fan of soft power and foreign foreign policy. The military has a very limited ability to change things, and they know it more than anybody else. So I think you're an outstanding choice. I intend to vote for you, but we're going to quickly go around the world and try to get a 30,000-foot view of where we start this new administration. Do you still consider Iran the largest state sponsor of terrorism?
I do.
Okay. Do you consider Israel a racist nation?
No, I do not.
Okay, that's a good start. Afghanistan. Do you agree that I agree totally with Senator Shaheen that if we abandon the Afghan women who fought so hard to have a say about the future of their children, it will affect our children's future. Do you agree with that?
I do.
If we've learned anything from Afghanistan, taking an eye off the ball doesn't really work well. And having 100,000 troops over there spending trillions of dollars really doesn't work well either. We're down to 2,500, a residual force with a counterterrorism mission. Do you think that's responsible at this point?
I know the President-elect wants to make sure that even as we pull back our forces, that we retain the capacity to deal with any reemergence.
And anything would be conditions-based.
That's correct.
Do you trust the Taliban to police al-Qaeda and ISIS regarding attacking America?
Trust is not a word that I would apply.
No, that's right. I agree with you. So any agreement that trusts the Taliban to police al-Qaeda and ISIS without us having some say, I think would be a bad deal. Appreciate that very much. On immigration, you're soon going to be Secretary of State with hopefully a good bipartisan vote. I think you deserve it. What would you tell the people in a caravan coming toward America?
I would say do not come.
Yeah, I think that's a good message. We're going to work on comprehensive immigration reform. I'll try to help where I can, but just don't come. That creates more problems than it solves. When it comes to asylum seekers have been staying in Mexico under the Trump administration. Do you find value in that program?
I have issues with that program, Senator. I think that we need to make sure that we are approaching what we do when it comes to those seeking asylum, seeking protection in this country, in line with the finest traditions that this country has shown from generation to generation. Part of that is the ability, that is both, I believe, a legal one and a moral one from where I sit, to allow people to make asylum claims and to deal with those claims expeditiously. Yeah. People who need protection should get it. Those who do not meet the criteria should, with dignity, be removed. But our problem is that we're not resourced adequately to do this. Yeah. And that's what we need to work on.
If I could go a bit further, I think it's been gamed. I mean, I would like to increase the number of people that can come here seeking asylum. There are troubled parts of the world. A lot of people come here for economic reasons. They realize if they get one foot in the United States, claim asylum, they'll be giving a hearing date in the future, and most of them don't show up. Do you think we need to make sure that that narrative does not restart?
I agree, and we need a humane, a fair, and an orderly system That's imperative. And I know you've heard the President-elect talk about the...
Some people on the left have been saying that we should decriminalize entry into the country. Do you agree with that?
Not my jurisdiction, but I disagree.
Okay, all right. China. Secretary Pompeo designated the Chinese Communist Party as having engaged in genocide regarding the Uyghur Muslim population. Do you agree with that designation?
That would be my judgment as well.
You do agree?
Yes.
Yeah, we're on a good start here. So this really, I just very much appreciate that. Do you believe that the Chinese Communist Party misled the world about the coronavirus?
I do.
What price, if any, should they pay?
When it comes to China's role in the virus, I think we want to, there's, as you know, an investigation that is ongoing. We obviously want to see the results of that investigation, but there's some things we already know.
If they don't cooperate, what should we do?
I think that we have to look at very hard, because that cooperation, this is really the point, I think, of where we need to go on this. What we do know already with regard to China and the virus is that they did not provide transparency. They did not share information. They did not give access when it mattered most in the early days of this virus. Had they done so, it's possible that the course of the virus would have been different, and we could have dealt with it sooner and more effectively. My sense, Senator, going forward, is that what we should be focusing on, I know people talk about the punitive, I would be very focused on the preventative, which is to say, what steps will China take going forward?
Like wet markets.
For example, right. Yes, a very good example.
Yeah, I agree with that. When it comes to Taiwan, it's been the policy of the United States to basically, for lack of a better term, to guarantee Taiwanese democracy. What's your view of that?
My view is we have an abiding and longstanding and bipartisan commitment to Taiwan and to the Taiwan Relations Act. We need to make sure that they have the means to deter aggression, to defend themselves. I'd like to see Taiwan even more engaged in the world. It's in many ways a model democracy, a strong economy, and a technological powerhouse. And of course, the way they've dealt with COVID-19 has a lot of lessons to teach us.
But if the Chinese Communist Party decided to use military force against the population in Taiwan, that would create great upheaval throughout the world, and they would pay a heavy price. Is that fair to say?
That would be a grievous mistake on their part.
Hong Kong. Seems to be that they're not really paying much attention to what Congress is doing and what this administration is doing regarding Hong Kong. What can we do to get their attention that we're not doing?
So I wish we had taken some steps earlier. The national security law, the crackdown on media, the crackdown on free speech, on assembly, all of that has, I think, put in tatters the notion of real freedom and autonomy in Hong Kong, which were guarantees in the handover. One of the things, this is not going to fix the problem, but I'd like to see us, for example, be able to take in some of those fleeing Hong Kong and fleeing the repression for standing up for their democratic rights. And I know there's some legislation that looks at doing that. But I think we have to take a hard look about what our position should be on the presence of institutions and companies there. Is it going to remain a hub and a financial center? Does Beijing then get both sides of the benefit? We should take a hard look at that.
I think the first thing we have to do is send a stronger message, because they're clearly not listening to this Congress, and this administration's efforts, which I applaud, have fallen short. It's very difficult. When it comes to Turkey, the Congress has been pretty tough on Turkey for continuing to purchase Russian weapons and the S-400. Do you believe that Turkey needs to continue to be sanctioned until they change their behavior?
So I've looked at some of the so-called CATSA sanctions. I think that what Turkey has done as a NATO ally in acquiring the S-400s is unacceptable. The idea that a so-called strategic partner of ours would actually be in line with one of our biggest strategic competitors in Russia is not acceptable. I think we need to take a look to see the impact that the existing sanctions have had, and then determine whether there's more that needs to be done.
Okay, I think this administration may have, yesterday, I don't know, lifted a travel ban from Europe and other areas with a high COVID-19 infection rate. Are you considering restoring that ban?
So right now, that's
I would encourage you to.
That's it's above my pay grade, so.
I would encourage you to. And the reasons, the caravans have a multiple level of problems, and, it'd be odd to just keep a travel ban in Europe, but, allow people to mass on our border. So I hope we continue to fight the illness and prevent transmission. Finally, so many people wonder where our biggest threat is. I'm going to just end with this thought. China is a problem, multiple layer problem. Russia's up to no good. There's two groups out there that I worry the most about. I think if the Iranians had a nuclear weapon, they would use it. I think the Ayatollah is a religious Nazi. Will you agree to at least talk to me and Senator Menendez about an alternative to the JCPOA when it comes to Iran?
I welcome talking to both of you and members of this committee about the way forward on Iran.
Okay. And finally, this is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. September this year will be 20 years. I think they're going to remind us that they're still out there. Do you agree with me that the worst thing America could do is have a false sense of security when it comes to radical Islam? Do you agree with the following proposition? The only reason they haven't killed more of us is they can't find a way to do it, and we pretty much kept our foot on their throat.
I share your concerns about the ongoing threat posed by what's left of al-Qaeda, ISIS, other extremist groups that target the United States.
Finally, do you believe they had a nuclear or chemical weapon they could acquire when they would use it?
I think there's a high probability that if they had access to such a weapon, certainly in the past they would have, and going forward, something to be concerned about.
20 years later, where do we stand regarding the fight against al-Qaeda and ISIS?
I think we've demonstrably made significant progress in different parts of the world against them when it comes to al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, the original threat. There's still a problem. There's still a presence. There's still a relationship with the Taliban. It's much diminished from what it was, but precisely to your point, if we take our eye off that ball, there's a risk that it comes back. ISIS, I think, actually across two administrations, we succeeded in taking away its geographic caliphate in Iraq and in Syria. But there again, we can't take our eye off the ball. And then, of course, we've seen affiliates of both groups spread to different parts of the world. So we still have our work cut out for us.
Well, thank you. I look forward to working with you.
Thanks.
I think all of us agree with those comments, and particularly right now, for whatever reason, the Sahel seems to be their preferred place to reemerge. So that's something that's going to need your attention. With that, Senator Murphy, you've been incredibly patient from the very beginning, but I'm going to ask you to be patient for a little longer, and we will take a 10-minute humanitarian break. The committee will be at ease, subject to call the chair.